Producers, stop making bad chord progressions. The chord progression is the basis for all of your melodies. So if you want to have a good melody, you need a good chord progression. And let me show you how to do that. So the first thing I always tell people to do when they're making chord progressions is to start out with your bass notes. What this means is this is going to be the lowest note in your chord progression. And at the end of it, this is like a basis for your chords. It'll present the vibe for what you're going for. It'll set the mood, and overall it'll help you come up with some chords. So the best way to come up with your bass notes is to put down notes that sound good together. Treat it like a melody on its own. So because my bass notes are ascending here, this is going to give it a bit of a hopeful vibe. So the next thing we want to do is build triads. And the best way to build triads in this situation is to build the triads around your bass notes. So first, you're probably wondering what a triad is. Pretty much a triad is 3 notes that are in the scale that are played at the same time. And to make a basic triad, you'll put down your root note of the chord, skip the next scale note, go up 1 and put a note there, and repeat that. So I'm skipping the G sharp here, and then I'm going up to the A sharp. So when you're building your triads, you want to build around what you've already set as your bass notes. So I've put down some chords here, and as you can see, the root note of these 2 chords is the same as the bass notes, and you're probably looking at this chord and realizing that there's no B in the chord. However, if we bring that B up an octave, you'll notice that this makes a 7th chord. There's a triad here, and then there's a note on top. We'll talk a bit more about 7th chords later on in the video. So let's talk about 7th chords now. So we have our triads here, and like I talked about, you do the skip note, bring the note up. That's how you make your triads. You do the same thing for making 7th and 9th chords. So let's say I want to turn this into a 7th chord. I'd go up here, skip this note that's in key, and go up 1 more. And if I wanted to turn this into a 9th chord, I'd do the same thing again. 7th and 9th chords are a good way to provide a neutral feel to chords, and the reason this provides a neutral feel is due to the intervals within the chord. So from the D sharp to the F sharp here, we have a minor interval, and then from the F sharp to the A sharp, we have a major interval. This is what makes up a minor chord, and the opposite can be said about a major chord. So here we have D sharp major, and there's a major interval between the D sharp and the G, and then a minor interval between the G and the A sharp. Now with those 2 triads, if we look up here, there's a minor interval on top of this major interval, and then there will be a major interval on top of this minor interval. So if we remove the root note of the chord, which here it's a minor chord and here it's a major chord, we now have a major chord and a minor chord here. So it's like stacking a minor chord on top of a major chord, or stacking a major chord on top of a minor chord. So one great thing about 7th and 9th chords is it makes your chords dense, but sometimes it'll change the vibe of your chord like I just talked about, and you might not want to do that. And in this situation, you might still want a dense chord, a more full sound. And something easy that you can do to make this happen is just take the root notes of your chords and copy those up an octave. This will make your chords sound more full without changing the vibe of your chords too much. So something important to note is every scale has a diminished chord. I know we just talked about minor chords and major chords, but there's another kind of chord, and that's diminished chords. In minor scales, it's the 2nd note in the key that makes up the basis for diminished chords, and in major scales, it's the 7th. So if we see here, it's actually just a minor interval stacked on top of a minor interval, and it sounds really off-putting and eerie. This makes it good for dark trap songs, as well as using it as a transition chord to go back into the root chord of the scale. So with this chord progression here, you've probably noticed that each chord is not hitting on each bar. And this leads into a really great point, and that's that every scale has only 7 notes to the scale. So you can only really get so creative with your chord progressions, but timing is a much more infinite factor, and you can play around with the timing a lot more like I've done here. Now let's talk about inversions. Let's say you have some triads here, and your chord notes are very far apart. Because of that, your chords will sound a little bit disjointed. So something you can do here is take the notes at the bottom and bring them up an octave, like this, and this would be just an inversion. And this really highlights the importance of keeping chord notes close together. And by having the chord notes closer together, it makes the chords transition a lot smoother. So I know we talked about having dense chord progressions, but sometimes you may want your chords to be a little bit more spread out. This gives your chords a little bit more of an open feel, and it can give your chords more of an emotional vibe. And my favorite trick to make my chords more spread out is I just like to take the 3rd of each chord, like I'm doing here, and I like to bring that up an octave. So this next bit is really important in trap melodies, and that's suspensions. Metro Boomin loves to do this in his melodies. Let's just say I have this minor chord here throughout. You can take the 3rd here and bring it to the 2nd or to the 4th, and that would be a suspension. Now Now I know I talked about timing earlier, and you can really play around with that when you arpeggiate your chords. And pretty much arpeggiation is just chopping up the chord notes to play at different times so they're not all playing together like I've done here. And as well, for this example, I'm using a suspended fourth on these chords. And finally, one of the most important things I find when making my chord progressions is humanizing my chords. So two of my favorite ways to do this are strumming the chords, which you can do in FL Studio by pressing Alt-S. A little strummizer will pop up. You've got some settings to play around with. And my other favorite way to humanize the chords is by randomizing the velocities. And you can do this in FL Studio by pressing Alt-R. So this little menu will pop up, it's called the randomizer. It doesn't just do velocity, you have a lot of other things you can play around with, but I'm just gonna play around with the velocity a bit here. And this will make your chords sound a lot less robotic. Anyways, that's been everything you need to know about making good chord progressions. Shout out to the channel members displayed on screen right now. If you want to join the channel, you can press that join button down below and gain exclusive member perks, and peace.